My family said they just wanted peace, but peace meant pretending I didn't exist. When Mom banned me from my sister's wedding for being the unlucky one, I booked a one-way ticket to Greece. I thought I was escaping shame. Instead, I walked straight into freedom. An accidental wedding, a viral video, and the kind of revenge you don't plan, but life writes for you. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The smell of coffee hit me before I even crossed the threshold. My mother always brewed it strong enough to wake the whole neighborhood. Dark, roast, bitter, no sugar. The radio was murmuring about wedding season in the Midwest when I stepped into the kitchen. The sound felt almost cruelly ironic. "Morning, Mom," I said, setting my suitcase by the doorway. She didn't look up. Margaret Bennett sat at the kitchen island in her pale blue cardigan, her hair pinned tight, a stack of cream-colored papers spread neatly before her. Guest list menu options, floral samples, the holy trinity of her perfection. "Oh," she said, finally glancing at me over her reading glasses. "You made it." "Yeah," I said, smiling too wide. 2 years away seemed long enough. Across the room, my father, Richard, poured hot water into a chipped mug. He gave me that small, helpless smile he'd perfected over the years. The one that said, "I see you, but I can't help you." I tried to sound casual. "So how's the big day coming along?" "Grace must be excited." My mother's pen scratched across the paper. "She's radiant. The Parkers are hosting the rehearsal dinner at their country club. It'll be elegant but understated. Just what I wanted for her. Just what I wanted. Not her. Never her." I nodded toward the paper. "Is that the guest list?" She hummed an absent-minded yes. I leaned over, scanning the neat rows of names in her slanted cursive. Friends, cousins, neighbors. Then silence when my eyes reached the end. "I don't see mine," I said lightly. The pen stopped. "Your name?" "Yeah." I laughed a little, though it caught in my throat. Maybe it got lost between the florist and the caterer. Margaret didn't look up. It didn't get lost. The words were simple, but the air shifted. "Mom," I said slowly. "You mean I'm not invited?" She set the pen down with the precision of a surgeon. "Clara, don't make this harder than it has to be. You know how people talk. It's bad luck for a single woman to be at the altar before the bride. It draws attention. Bad luck." I repeated, half a whisper, half a laugh. "That's new." She sighed as if I'd proven her point just by existing. "You have a way of making things uncomfortable. This weekend needs to be perfect. For once, can we just have peace?" I stared at her, at the diamond ring flashing in the morning light as she folded the papers. The ring had always gleamed like a symbol of everything she valued. Stability, control, appearances. My father cleared his throat softly. "Margaret." She cut him off with a look. He turned back to his tea, stirring in silence. I forced a smile, because that's what I'd been trained to do. "Of course. You're right. I don't want to ruin anything." Margaret's lips curved, but her eyes stayed cold. "I'm glad you understand. Understand. That word again. The one that meant agree or disappear." I picked up my mug from the counter, my hand trembling just enough to make the coffee ripple. The bitterness burned my tongue, but I swallowed anyway. "Well," I said quietly, "I hope it's everything you've ever dreamed of." "Thank you, dear," she said, already turning back to her papers. "I'm sure it will be." I walked out before she could see the way my composure cracked. The screen door creaked open, the early spring air biting at my face. Outside, the world looked painfully calm, neatly trimmed hedges, robins pecking at the lawn, sunlight spilling across the white porch railing. Behind me, I heard the faint clink of dishes, her voice blending into the radio announcer's. I stood there until my father joined me on the porch, his steps slow, deliberate. "She didn't mean it like that," he said, though his tone betrayed the lie. I looked at him, really looked, at the deep lines carved from decades of avoiding conflict. "Yeah, Dad, she did." He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wish I could fix it." "You can't," I said, and forced a smile. "Just promise me you'll enjoy the wedding." He hesitated, then reached out and squeezed my shoulder. "Take care of yourself, kiddo." I nodded. "Always do." When I slid into my car, the air felt thick, heavy. Through the kitchen window, I caught one last glimpse of my mother. She was folding the guest list, slipping it into a gold envelope, efficient and unbothered. The sunlight caught her wedding ring again. cold, blinding. I started the engine, the hum, filling the silence that had swallowed me whole. As I backed down the driveway, I watched her close the kitchen door behind her, that final, practiced motion of a woman sealing her world tight. In the rearview mirror, I saw the house getting smaller, softer, until it looked almost peaceful. I whispered to myself, I thought I'd grown up, but maybe you never stop being the kid left out of the family picture. The road stretched out ahead, flat and endless, and I pressed the gas, chasing the horizon, just to remember what freedom felt like. The highway stretched out like an endless ribbon of sunburnt gold. I rolled the window halfway down and let the dry spring wind whip through my hair. Every few miles, a billboard flashed by. Church picnics, farm auctions, a new furniture outlet. The kind of America that pretended change didn't exist. I used to love road trips. When I was younger, they meant freedom. Radio turned up a suitcase full of possibilities, the thrill of not knowing what came next. Now, the miles just reminded me how far I'd gone to become someone my family still refused to see. The sun hung low, bleeding orange over flat fields of wheat. Somewhere between Terre Haute and the Oregon border, I felt the first sting of memory. When I was 10, I'd drawn a wedding dress on the back of my homework sheet, chalky blue, with a long train and a ribbon that shimmered when I held it to the light. I ran to show my mother, proud of the lace I'd copied from one of her magazines. She barely looked at it. Stop wasting time dreaming, Clara. You'll end up disappointed. I remembered standing there, fingers smudged with chalk, the drawing limp in my hand. I never drew another wedding dress again. Years later, in 2015, a photo of one of my designs had made the front page of Bridal West, a vineyard ceremony in Napa, soft lighting, roses the color of old wine, a bride who cried when she saw it all come together. The caption read, "Wild Grace Events brings magic to reality." My mother called that night. I thought she'd say she was proud. Instead, "You can't live off fairy tales forever, Clara." By the time she hung up, I'd stopped believing she'd ever understand the difference between illusion and beauty. A semi roared past, shaking the car. I blinked, coming back to the present. The dashboard clock said 5:43 p.m. I hadn't eaten since morning, so I pulled off at a rest stop outside Lincoln. The sky burned with color, orange fading to pink into lavender. I stepped out, stretched, and checked my phone. One new text. Dad. You deserve to be seen. Just 6 words. No punctuation. Typical him. Gentle, quiet, the kind of man who said everything without saying much at all. I stared at the message for a long minute, then lifted my phone and took a photo of the horizon. The colors bled into each other like watercolors left in the rain. I sent the picture to Laura Kim, my best friend and former business partner in Portland. Thinking about going further, I typed. She replied almost immediately. Further where? Somewhere no one knows me. She called before I could put the phone away. Her voice buzzed through the car speakers, warm and familiar. Okay, first of all, that sounds like the beginning of a bad movie. Second, are you okay? I smiled faintly. I'm fine, just tired. I spent 3 hours pretending not to be offended. Oh God, what did she say this time? Apparently my single presence would bring bad luck. Laura let out a sharp breath. You're kidding. I wish. There was silence for a few seconds, then she said softly, You don't have to keep earning her love, you know. I swallowed. I'm not trying to. I just thought, after all these years, maybe she'd let me show up. Then show up somewhere else, she said. Show up for yourself. The words lingered long after we hung up. When I reached Portland, it was nearly midnight. My apartment sat on the top floor of an old brick building that used to be a bakery. I'd filled it with leftover props from weddings, fairy lights, old cameras, stacks of fabric samples. It always smelled faintly of lavender and glue. I dropped my keys on the counter and turned on the lamp. The space looked smaller than I remembered, as if the walls had moved in during my absence. On the far wall hung the sign I'd designed when I first started the company Wild Grace Events. Making days worth remembering. I stood there staring at it, the irony cutting deeper with every second. I'd spent years curating joy for strangers, picking songs for first dances, arranging flowers that matched sunsets, writing vows for people who couldn't find the words. Yet no one had ever asked what happiness looked like for me. The city outside was quiet, just the hum of distant traffic. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the edge of the bed, and opened my laptop. The search bar blinked back at me a small pulsing dare. I typed flights to Santorini. Dozens of options appeared. White cliffs, blue domes, Seas that looked like melted sapphire. A place that had always lived somewhere in my imagination filed under someday. I hovered over the word book. For a long moment, I thought about Grace's wedding. The pastel bridesmaid dresses, the manicured lawns, the toasts about family and faith. The image blurred with another me at the edge of a cliff, somewhere far away, breathing air, untouched by judgment. Maybe leaving wasn't running. Maybe it was finally stopping. I clicked. The soft chime of confirmation filled the silence. My flight was in 48 hours. The glow from the screen lit the room, catching the dust drifting in slow circles. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted, but strangely light. For the first time in months, my chest didn't feel like a locked room. Outside, the city hummed quietly, the sky just beginning to fade from orange to black. I closed my laptop and whispered into the stillness. I'm going somewhere I can finally breathe. The plane touched down in Athens with a jolt that shook me awake. My neck ached from sleeping against the window, and the overhead lights flickered on like a slow sunrise. The intercom buzzed in Greek, a language that sounded like music I'd never learned the words to. By the time I stepped into the terminal, it felt like I'd crossed more than an ocean. The air was different, humid, salty, heavy with something sweet, maybe orange blossoms or jet fuel. The airport pulsed with noise luggage wheels, clattering babies, crying, tourists shouting in every language I could name, and a few I couldn't. I was no one here, just another traveler dragging her suitcase through the noise, and for once, that anonymity felt like freedom. It's strange how small you feel when no one knows you, and somehow that smallness feels like peace. Customs took forever, but eventually I was outside blinking under the harsh Aegean sun. The cab driver spoke rapid Greek into his phone as he loaded my bag into the trunk, barely acknowledging me, before weaving through traffic like we were late for something sacred. 2 hours later, I was on a ferry, slicing across the blue expanse of the Aegean Sea. The wind tangled my hair and salt crusted on my lips. Santorini appeared slowly in the distance. White buildings stacked like spilled sugar cubes on cliffs that bled into the water. The domes glowed cobalt under the sun, and for the first time in months, I exhaled without feeling like I owed the world an apology. By the time we docked, the afternoon light had softened to gold. I followed a driver up a narrow, twisting road carved into the cliffside. He stopped at a stone villa framed by olive trees. "Villa De Luca," he said, nodding toward a man standing near the gate, Clara Bennett. The man greeted in accented English. He was tall, mid-40s, skin browned from the sun eyes, warm and curious. "Marco De Luca. My family owns this place. It was my father's house before it became a retreat. You'll like it here." He carried my bag up the cobblestone path while I trailed behind, stunned by the view. The sea stretched endlessly below waves, brushing the rocks like whispers. Inside, the villa was simple but beautiful. Whitewashed walls, arched doorways, linen curtains billowing in the breeze. Marco set the suitcase down by the window and handed me a key shaped like an olive branch. "I should tell you," he said, smiling. "You're not the only American staying here this month. One of my tenants is also, how do you say, creative?" I frowned. "Oh," he nodded toward the staircase. "Ethan Cole, photographer. You know him." My breath caught before I could hide it. Ethan Cole. Marco's grin widened. "Yes, you two are friends." "Something like that," I said softly. Later, as the sun slipped behind the cliffs, I found myself wandering the narrow streets of Oya. Every corner smelled like grilled fish, lemon, and sea air. Couples laughed over wine glasses, children chased pigeons down marble steps. I ducked into a small cafe clinging to the edge of the cliff, its patio strung with lanterns that swayed in the wind. And there he was. Ethan sat alone at a corner table, a camera beside his half-empty cup of espresso. His hair was longer now, darker from the sun. A short beard framed the same mouth that used to say my name like a secret. For a moment, I just watched him the way people look at old houses they used to live in. He looked up, caught me staring, and smiled. "Clara Bennett," he said, rising to his feet. "I thought Greece was too romantic for you." I laughed, easing into the familiarity that still felt dangerous. "I never said that. I just never made it here." "Well," he said, pulling out a chair, "welcome to the dream." We sat, the silence between us thick, but not hostile. The years folded in on themselves, blurring the edges of memory. "I heard you were doing big things in Portland," he said. "Wild Grace events, right? I saw a spread in Vogue last year." You were everywhere for a while, I smiled wryly. Until I wasn't. He tilted his head. That sounds like a story. Maybe one day. He didn't press. That was the thing about Ethan. He always knew when to leave space for the truth to breathe. He told me he was working on a project for a travel magazine photographing Love is Real, a series about authentic connections. Couples who weren't polished or perfect, but honest. People are tired of filters, he said. They want something real, something raw. That's rare, I said. Not as rare as you think. He replied, his eyes holding mine a little too long. You just have to look in the right light. We finished our drinks as the sky deepened to violet. When I stood to leave, he stopped me. Actually, I could use your eye. The next shoot needs a stylist, and the local options are limited. I hesitated. I'm supposed to be on vacation. Then consider it an adventure, he said. 1 or 2 days. Nothing serious. I looked at him at the way the lantern light caught the side of his face, softening the lines that time had carved. I don't have any plans, I said, so why not? He smiled slow and knowing. Good, we start tomorrow. Outside, the wind off the sea was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of jasmine. We walked together along the cliff path back toward the villa, saying little. Below us, waves crashed against the rocks in steady rhythm. When we reached the fork in the road, Ethan paused. The lanterns flickered above us. You know, he said, his voice quiet, there are people who don't need to be invited to belong here. They just do. I looked out at the horizon where the sea met the stars. For a second, I couldn't find my voice. I'm not sure I've ever been one of them. I finally said. Maybe you've just been looking in the wrong place, he replied. We stood there for another moment, the silence between us stretching wide and peaceful. Then he nodded goodnight and walked up the hill, his camera swinging at his side. I stayed until he disappeared from view, the night wrapping around me like a whisper. The waves below glittered in the moonlight, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd arrived somewhere I didn't have to apologize for existing. The next few days blurred together in sun and wind. Santorini felt like a dream rendered in white and blue, every wall and rooftop glowing under the relentless light. I followed Ethan through the maze of narrow streets, carrying bundles of fabric, adjusting floral crowns, holding reflectors when the breeze got too strong. He worked with quiet precision, rarely speaking unless it mattered. It was easy to forget the rest of the world here, the one that measured worth in invitations and expectations. In the mornings, we shot by the cliffs where the sea looked like liquid glass. At noon, we ducked into small tavernas to cool off, sipping iced coffee thick with sugar. At night, we edited photos on the terrace, the laptop screen glowing between us. It was the closest I'd felt to content in years, though I didn't dare name it that. On the 4th day, as we packed up the gear, Ethan asked, "Do you ever tell your clients about your family?" I gave a short laugh. You mean the family who believes my single presence brings bad luck? He looked at me, waiting. I shrugged. Not really. They hire me for the illusion of perfection. No one wants to know the planner's family is broken. He nodded slowly. They're afraid of you, you know, afraid. He turned his camera toward the horizon, adjusting the lens. People fear what shines too brightly. They think your light will make theirs look smaller. I wanted to dismiss it, but something in his tone sank deep. We walked in silence back to the villa. Marco was waiting, sleeves rolled up, hands dusted with sawdust. Before you two finish, he said in his lilting Italian accent, I have something you might use for one last shot. He disappeared into a storage room and returned holding a garment bag. Inside was a wedding dress. Simple vintage silk that had yellowed slightly at the edges. Belonged to my mother, Marco said. The light loves fabric like this. You try. I hesitated. It's too beautiful to wear for fun. That's exactly why he said, smiling. Ethan gave me a half grin. For the art, right? Right, I said, though my heart fluttered as I took it. I changed inside the villa. The dress fit better than it should have, the fabric soft against my skin. I stepped outside, squinting under the sunlight. Ethan froze for a second before lifting his camera. Don't move, he said. The air was warm, thick with salt and the faint scent of jasmine. My bare feet pressed against the cool stone. Look at me, Ethan murmured, lowering the camera. He stepped closer, adjusting the neckline slightly so the fabric caught the light. His fingers brushed my collarbone, and for a breath, the world went still. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. Then laughter echoed down the path. A group of American tourists had wandered into the courtyard. They stopped, wide-eyed. One woman clasped her hands together. "Oh my God, it's a wedding!" Before I could correct her, another shouted, "Congratulations," and someone started clapping. Ethan glanced at me, amusement flickering in his eyes. Should we tell them? I shook my head, laughing for real this time. "Not yet." He extended his hand, half teasing. "Then shall we, Mrs. Cole?" I rolled my eyes, but took his hand anyway, just for the photo. The tourists cheered, pulling out their phones, snapping pictures, as if we were some secret ceremony they'd stumbled upon. "Say something romantic," one of them yelled. Ethan leaned closer, voice low. "If all we have is today," he whispered, "let's make it beautiful." For a moment, I forgot the cameras, the strangers, the years between us. The sea blazed behind him, the light catching the edges of his hair. I smiled, really smiled, the kind that starts somewhere deep and spills out before you can stop it. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. The tourists clapped louder. Someone shouted, "Kiss her," and everyone laughed. We didn't, but it didn't matter. The sun dipped lower, staining the horizon gold, and everything felt suspended in that glowing, impossible light. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed one of the tourists step back, raising her phone for a wider shot. She caught us, framed perfectly against the ocean, the wind catching the veil Marco had pinned to my hair, the sunlight flaring through it. I didn't know her name. I didn't even see her face, but the soft click of her phone camera felt like fate sealing something I couldn't yet understand. When the group finally wandered off, laughing and waving, I turned to Ethan, still breathless. That was ridiculous. He lowered his camera and grinned. "Maybe, but tell me you didn't feel it." I looked out at the sea, at the light breaking into fragments on the water. I felt something, I admitted. He nodded as if that was enough. "Good. Sometimes something is all you need." We stood there until the last bit of sun vanished behind the cliffs. The world went quiet, except for the distant hum of cicadas and the shutter of Ethan's camera capturing one final frame. I didn't know what to call what had just happened. A joke, a spark, or a moment stolen from time. But I knew this for the first time in longer than I could remember. I didn't feel invisible. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and wild thyme. The veil fluttered, brushing against my face like a benediction. Somewhere behind us, the faint laughter of the tourists faded into the sound of the sea. I stood there in that borrowed dress, the sky bleeding into dusk, and thought, maybe this is what it feels like when life accidentally gives you a miracle. The light was already spilling through the curtains when I woke up soft and blue, the kind of morning that made everything look calm, even when it wasn't. The villa was quiet, except for the faint hum of cicadas outside. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. Then I saw the dress draped across the chair, the vintage silk still carrying a hint of salt air, and it all came rushing back. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and started scrolling through old emails. A client from Seattle wanted to rebook for a fall wedding. Another asked if I could send sample photos from a vineyard shoot. I was halfway through a reply when my phone buzzed on the counter. Laura's name flashed across the screen. "Morning," I said, trying to sound awake. Her voice came through in a rush. "Clara, you're trending." "What?" "On TikTok. You need to look right now." My heart skipped. "What are you talking about?" "I'm sending you the link," she said. "Oh my God, it's beautiful. Like movie beautiful." The notification popped up before she even hung up. I clicked it without thinking. The video opened to a familiar view. The Santorini cliffs drenched in gold light. A bride in a simple silk dress standing barefoot on a stone terrace. A man beside her, sunlight tangled in his hair. Me. The title read, "A Real Wedding in Santorini." The view count. 2 million, and climbing. My throat went dry. I turned up the volume just enough to hear the waves. The laughter, someone shouting congratulations in the background. Then the caption appeared. "Love finds you when you stop chasing it." The account name, Helen Moore, travel blogger. I sat frozen, watching myself laugh in slow motion, the veil fluttering behind me, Ethan's hand brushing mine. In the comments, strangers had turned us into a story. Who are they? "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Proof that real love still exists." I scrolled until the words blurred. My hand was shaking. I hadn't posted anything. I hadn't even told anyone where I was. Millions of people had just watched me smile. A smile even my own mother had probably never seen. The door burst open, startling me. Ethan strode in, his camera bag slung over his shoulder, phone in hand. "You've seen it?" I nodded. Laura called. He handed me his phone screen, glowing with notifications. Headlines, reposts, tags. The Santorini wedding that stole the internet. A mystery couple goes viral. Is this the most authentic love story ever? They think it was real, he said. I laughed nervously. We were joking. Ethan, it was a photo shoot. The internet doesn't believe in jokes, he said quietly. It believes in moments. I sank into the chair, staring at the screen. So now I'm what? A runaway bride who found love on an island? He sat across from me, leaning forward. We can explain it if you want. Tell them it was just art. I thought of the tourists cheering, the warmth of the light on my skin, the way that one woman's camera had caught everything perfectly timed and unreal. If we explain it, we ruin it, I said finally. People saw something they needed to believe. He studied me. And what about you? What do you believe? I looked out the window. The sea shimmered indifferent to all of it. I believe I didn't plan this, and that might be the only honest thing I've done in years. We spent the afternoon pretending nothing had changed. Marco brought wine from the cellar and joked about having a celebrity guest. I laughed because it was easier than trying to understand the storm that was already forming across the ocean. By sunset, the article count had doubled. There were screenshots of my face threads on Reddit, guessing who we were. Wedding blogs dissecting my style. I watched the numbers climb like a tide I couldn't stop. When the sky turned violet, Ethan came to find me. You should eat something. I'm not hungry, I said. He hesitated. You okay? I don't know. I think the world just made up a version of me that's happier than I am. He smiled sadly. Maybe that version deserves to exist, even if it's not the whole truth. That night after he left, I sat on the balcony, the moon high and silver above the sea. The air smelled of salt and jasmine again. My phone buzzed non-stop on the table beside me, but I didn't pick it up. The ocean below glittered like spilled glass. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing a guitar, the sound soft and low. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the night breathe around me. Maybe the world didn't need another perfect story. Maybe it just needed to believe that happiness could happen by accident. And maybe I needed to believe it too. By the third morning, my phone looked like it was bleeding light. Notifications stacked endlessly, one after another, until the sound itself felt like static in my veins. Every app, every news outlet, every stranger suddenly seemed to know my name. I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling until I couldn't. The Santorini bride, who broke the internet. Banned from her sister's wedding, she found her own. The real-life fairy tale. Everyone's talking about. Each headline sounded like a version of me I'd never met. Laura texted from Portland. You're a phenomenon, babe. Hashtag Clara Bennett is everywhere. People are obsessed. I stared at the screen thumb hovering over her message, then powered the phone off. The silence that followed felt like a heartbeat returning after too long underwater. Outside, the island buzzed with tourists and sunlight. I slipped on my sandals and walked toward the beach, keeping my head down as groups posed for photos against the same white walls that had framed mine. I watched a young couple record a TikTok laughing as they pretended to propose their friends clapping off camera. No one looked at me, not really. I was invisible again except on screens. I walked along the shore until the noise of town faded, the sea stretching out like a mirror. My reflection wavered in the tide, a stranger's face staring back. I wanted to throw my phone into the water to erase the story before it swallowed me whole. I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted to forget the day my mother said I was bad luck. Later that afternoon, I found Ethan on the terrace, editing photos on his laptop. His camera bag was open, lenses scattered across the table. You've gone global, he said without looking up. Congratulations to me, I guess. He turned the screen toward me. A magazine headline glowed in bold print. A modern-day fairy tale. Or a PR stunt. They're already questioning it, he said. Of course they are, I replied. The internet doesn't believe in happiness unless it can tear it apart. Ethan leaned back in his chair, squinting at the sea. You can ignore it, you know. Let the noise fade. I tried. I said, sitting beside him. It doesn't stop. I feel like the whole world is trying to rewrite my life for me. He looked at me then, steady and calm. They only can if you let them. I didn't let them. I said quietly. I just existed. For 1 second I wasn't careful, and somehow that's what went viral. He smiled, small but real. Maybe that's why it worked. Because it wasn't careful. We sat there for a while, the sound of gulls cutting through the air. The breeze carried the smell of salt and rosemary from the garden below. "Do you ever wish you could disappear?" I asked. "All the time," he said. "But then I remember, disappearing doesn't fix what you left behind. It just makes you quieter." He handed me a glass of wine. Sometimes silence costs something, but it also buys peace. "And you still get to decide what this story means. It's yours, Clara, not theirs." His words settled like sand after a wave. That evening, after he left for dinner with Marco, I opened my laptop. Emails flooded my inbox, interview requests, sponsorships, articles translated into languages I couldn't read. I scrolled past all of them until I saw one familiar name in the sender line. Dad. The subject line was empty. The message itself was only one sentence. "Your mom saw the video. She didn't say anything." I read it once, then again. The screen's glow flickered against the window, reflecting my face back at me. For years, her silence had been a weapon, sharp, deliberate, cutting me out of every picture that didn't fit her world. But this time it felt different. Her silence wasn't rejection. It was confusion, maybe even surrender. For the first time, her quiet didn't hurt. It felt like the beginning of something I couldn't name yet. Outside night fell slowly, the horizon melting into deep blue. The village lights flickered on small and gold against the darkness. I stepped out onto the balcony, the air cool on my skin. The sea below shimmered under 1,000 stars. And for a brief moment, I understood why people believed in miracles. My phone buzzed again inside. I ignored it until the light from the screen spilled across the terrace floor. I walked back in, glanced down, and froze. A new message. Grace Parker. I stared at her name, my pulse quickening. My sister hadn't called me in over a year, not since our last argument about the family about who was the problem. The message preview only showed 2 words I saw. I didn't open it, not yet. I turned off the light and stepped back outside, leaning against the railing. The stars looked close enough to touch, and the waves below kept whispering their patient rhythm. For the first time since everything started, I didn't feel angry. I just felt awake. The night hummed quietly around me, full of things waiting to be said. The sun had barely risen over Indiana when the first news van pulled up in front of my parents' house. By 8 o'clock, there were 4. Reporters stood on the lawn microphones, ready, their breath fogging in the cool morning air. The old white siding of the Bennett home gleamed under the camera lights like a stage set that hadn't asked to be built. From 1,000 miles away, I watched the clip later. How my mother, Margaret, stepped onto the porch in her pressed cardigan, her hair perfectly set, her expression tight as glass. Mrs. Bennett. A reporter called, "What do you think about your daughter being called a symbol of freedom?" She hesitated for half a second, just enough to betray the smallest crack. "No comment," she said softly. Flashbulbs popped. Another reporter shouted, "Is it true you banned her from the wedding?" Her lips tightened. "Please," she said, and turned back inside. The footage was online within an hour. By noon, hashtags were everywhere. Hashtag Mother of Silence, hashtag The Silent Mom, hashtag Clara Bennett. Millions of strangers had turned my mother's restraint into a metaphor. I sat in bed in Santorini, phone buzzing non-stop on the nightstand. Every email subject line felt heavier than the last. Sponsorship offers, interview requests, a morning talk show invitation from New York America's favorite runaway bride. Laura called as I scrolled through it all. "Clara." "This is insane," she said, half breathless. "Everyone wants a piece of this story. They're offering serious money, brand deals, magazine covers, even a book." I rubbed my temple. "I don't want to turn an accident into a business." "It's not an accident anymore," she said gently. "It's a movement. Hashtag Love Without Permission is trending." I closed my laptop. "Laura, I didn't mean to start anything. I just wanted to disappear for a while." She sighed on the other end. "Then disappear after you cash a check," she said softly, trying to make me laugh. But I didn't. When the call ended, I stepped out onto the terrace. The sea stretched endless and bright, glittering in the morning sun. I could hear laughter drifting up from the cliffs below, tourists taking photos in the same spot where everything had started. Ethan appeared at the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. You look like someone who hasn't slept. I haven't, I said. He sat beside me, passing me a cup. It's not your fault, he said. You didn't choose to be seen. The world just decided to look. I stared out at the horizon. My mother spent her whole life wanting to be seen. I've spent mine running from it. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence between us was enough. Later, I opened my inbox again. My father's name sat near the top, the same one-line message as before, just forwarded through another account. Your mother saw the interviews. She's keeping quiet. That word again. Quiet. The same word that used to mean punishment now felt like surrender. Or maybe mercy. I shut the laptop and went for a walk down the hill toward the beach. The path wound between olive trees, their silver leaves rustling in the wind. I passed a cafe where the radio played an American talk show broadcast. And now the viral wedding everyone's talking about, the host said cheerfully. Was it real love? Or a brilliant PR stunt? Another voice chimed in, sarcastic but intrigued. Maybe it's a metaphor for modern relationships, chaotic, unplanned, but somehow beautiful. I stopped listening after that. Their voices faded into the hum of the sea. By late afternoon, the sunlight turned honey gold again. I found Ethan on the terrace fixing one of his cameras. He looked up, studying me quietly. Bad boy, I sat across from him. Just strange. I keep thinking how fast the world moves. 1 week ago, I was nobody. Now my mother's lawn is full of cameras. He almost set the screwdriver down. Fame doesn't change who you are, Clara. It just shows people what they missed before. I smiled faintly. You make it sound almost poetic, he shrugged. Maybe it is. The evening came soft and slow. I made dinner, half listening to the sound of waves hitting the cliffs below. Ethan poured wine, Marco dropped by for a toast, and for a while it almost felt normal again. But when the night settled and the others left, I sat alone with my phone. The screen lit up instantly, hundreds of new messages, all from people I didn't know. Compliments, confessions, proposals, invitations. And then, one name I did know. Grace Parker. My breath caught. I opened it. I'm sorry, Clara. I didn't know they hurt you like that. I was scared, of Mom, of losing her approval. But when I saw the video, I cried. I wish you'd been there. I wish I'd stood up for you. I read it twice, then a third time. The words blurred as my throat tightened. For years, I'd imagined her apology, how it might sound, what I'd say back. But now that it was real, I couldn't think of anything at all. Ethan walked in quietly, probably to say goodnight. When he saw my face, he stopped. Grace. I nodded, passing him the phone. He read the message, then looked up. His eyes soft. At least someone's starting to understand. I looked out through the glass doors at the moonlight spilling across the sea. Maybe that's enough, I whispered. He didn't answer, just reached over and gently squeezed my hand. The world outside buzzed with opinions, headlines, hashtags, but in that quiet space between us, I finally felt something close to peace. Rain began just after noon, a soft drizzle that blurred the horizon and turned the sea into a sheet of silver. The villa smelled like wet stone and coffee. I sat at the old wooden table by the window, my laptop open, inbox glowing with unread messages. There it was again. Grace Parker. For a few seconds, I just stared at her name. The last message had been short, almost shy. This one was longer. I could see the preview line, a single phrase, I need to tell you something. I clicked. The letter filled the screen, written in careful sentences that trembled between apology and confession. Dear Clara. Everyone thinks being the perfect daughter is easy. They see the dresses, the smiles, the polite answers. They don't see how much it hurts to live inside a script someone else wrote for you. Mom picked the dress for my wedding. She said it made me look respectable. I wanted something lighter, something that felt like me, but she said real brides don't chase trends. When I cried during the fitting, she told the seamstress I was just emotional. I smiled for the photos anyway. At the rehearsal dinner, I thanked everyone like she told me to. Make it sound natural, she said. I kept my voice steady while my chest felt like it was splitting. People called me graceful, but every time I smiled, I was afraid she'd see the crack. When your video went viral, I was angry at first. I thought you did it to embarrass us. But then I watched it again. Really watched it. You looked free, Clara. You weren't performing. You were alive. It hit me so hard I couldn't breathe. That's when I realized happiness doesn't need permission. It doesn't ask anyone to clap for it. It just exists. I hope I can find that someday the way you did. Love, Grace. I read it twice before I felt the tears. They came quietly without drama, just the kind that sting because you didn't expect them. Ethan walked in halfway through holding a cup of tea. He stopped when he saw me. You okay? I turned the laptop toward him. She wrote me. He didn't say anything while I read it out loud, voice breaking halfway through the line about the dress. When I finished, the rain had picked up, tapping against the windows like soft applause. Ethan reached over his hand, covering mine. That's beautiful, he said quietly. And honest. I nodded, wiping at my cheeks. It feels like hearing my own thoughts, but from someone else's body. He squeezed my hand. You both grew up in the same storm. You just learned different ways to survive it. I leaned back in the chair, letting the quiet settle. The rain outside grew heavier, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the ache in my chest. I opened a new email window. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time before I started typing. Dear Grace, you don't owe me an apology. I understand more than you think. I know what it's like to follow Mom's rules, to believe peace only exists if you never speak too loud or want too much. I lived that way for years. I don't blame you for staying. I know what it costs to leave, but I hope one day you'll stop asking who you're allowed to be. You're more than her idea of perfect. You always were. Love, Clara. I read it back once, then twice. My cursor blinked at the bottom like it was waiting for courage I didn't have. Ethan watched me, quiet but present. You going to send it? I shook my head. Not yet. Maybe she already knows. I closed the laptop gently and slid it aside. The rain had softened again, more mist than storm. I crossed the room and opened a small box on the shelf. The one I'd found at a market in Fira, carved with seashells and lined with linen. I folded the printed letter and slipped it inside. Some words, I said softly, aren't ready to travel yet. Ethan smiled faintly. Then keep them close until they are. I set the box back on the table and sat down beside him. We watched the rain together in silence. The sky outside glowed with the faint amber of a hidden sunlight fighting its way through the clouds. I thought about Grace in Indiana, maybe sitting by her own window, maybe still wearing the mask our mother had taught her to keep. For the first time, I didn't feel like her enemy. I felt like her mirror. We weren't on opposite sides. We'd just learned different languages for the same kind of love. As evening slipped in, the storm faded into a soft drizzle. The sea shimmered like polished glass, and a faint glow stretched across the horizon. I walked to the balcony, letting the damp air brush against my face. The light was warm now, fragile but persistent, the way forgiveness feels before you can name it. I stood there until the clouds began to break, and the first streak of sunset painted the water gold. My reflection in the glass looked calmer, clearer. For the first time in years, my anger felt small enough to let go. The sound of waves outside was soft, but the noise online was deafening. Every headline screamed my name like a verdict, the fake wedding of Santorini. Did Clara Bennett fool the internet from fairy tale to fraud? I sat at the kitchen table, the laptop glowing in front of me. Every tab was another accusation. Every opinion blurred into a chorus of disbelief. Laura called first. Clara, you can't just stay quiet. You have to respond. I don't owe them anything, I said, though my voice was tired. If you don't say something, they'll decide what the truth is for you. I'm used to that. I murmured. On the other end of the line, she exhaled hard. You've worked your whole life to build something real. Don't let them take that from you. Before I could answer, Ethan stepped into the room, phone in hand, his face drawn. You've seen this, right? He turned the screen toward me. A glossy entertainment site had posted a photo of us beneath a bold headline. Staged love sources claimed the viral couple faked their vows for publicity. He tossed the phone onto the table. We can sue. Defamation, misrepresentation, whatever it takes. They can't get away with this. I rubbed my temples. Ethan, stop. No, Clara. They're calling you a liar. I've been called worse, I said softly. He stared at me, frustrated. You don't have to let them walk all over you. I met his eyes. Maybe not. But I also don't have to prove myself to people who already decided what to believe. Silence stretched between us. The only sound was the wind pressing against the windows. I've spent most of my life trying to explain who I am. I said finally, maybe it's time to stop. Ethan sighed, sat across from me, and ran a hand through his hair. You think silence is justice? Sometimes, I said. Real justice doesn't always come with applause or lawsuits. Sometimes it's just knowing who you are when everyone else forgets. Later that afternoon, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Laura or Ethan. It was a woman from the Atlantic, a journalist named Julia Myers. Her voice was calm, professional, but not cold. I'm not calling for a scandal, she said. I'm calling because I think people are missing what this story really means. What does it mean? I asked, almost laughing. That's what I'd like to ask you, she said. One interview. You can approve the questions. No spin. Something in her tone, measured, patient, made me agree. The studio was small, tucked into a converted wine cellar overlooking the cliffs. The air smelled of dust and lemon oil. A single camera pointed at a wooden chair in front of a window where the Aegean light poured in like molten glass. Julia smiled as she clipped the mic to my collar. Ready. As I'll ever be, I said. The camera light blinked red. She started gently. When you first came to Santorini, did you expect any of this? Not at all, I said. I came here to forget who I was supposed to be. She nodded. Some people say your story gave them hope. Others say it was staged. What would you say to them, I thought for a moment. People see what they need to see. Some need a love story. Others need a villain. I can't be both, so I just decided to be honest. Julia leaned forward slightly. What does honesty mean to you now, not performing? I said, not explaining. Just being. Her expression softened. There's one question I have to ask. Do you have anything you'd like to say to your mother? For a second, the room went still. I could hear the faint hum of the camera. I looked toward the window where the sky had started turning pink over the sea. Yes, I said quietly. I'd tell her that sometimes silence is the strongest thing you can say, and sometimes love isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about not wanting anyone else to bleed for it. Julia watched me for a long moment before she smiled. I think she'll hear that she said, even if no one says it out loud. The interview ended soon after. When I stepped out into the hallway, the late afternoon sun hit the glass wall, scattering light across the floor. The air smelled faintly of salt and flowers from somewhere outside. On a rack by the exit hung the white silk dress from Marco's shoot, freshly pressed, its hem catching the sunlight. It swayed slightly in the breeze, almost alive. I stopped staring at it. For months it had followed me, a symbol, a curse, a misunderstanding. Now it just looked like fabric again. Freedom, I realized, didn't come from being believed. It came from not needing to be. I left the building without looking back, the echo of my footsteps fading into the quiet hum of the island. The morning light in Indiana looked softer on television than it ever did in real life. I watched it through the laptop screen from my kitchen table in Santorini. The blue sea stretched out behind me. A banner ran across the bottom of the broadcast exclusive, Margaret Bennett breaks her silence. Julia Myers sat opposite my mother in the same kind of calm, professional poise she'd shown with me. The camera framed my mother perfectly. Floral blouse, pearls, her hair curled the way she always wore it when she wanted the world to think everything was under control. Mrs. Bennett. Julia began gently. You've seen the stories, the interviews, the reaction around the world. Do you have anything you'd like to say to your daughter? My mother blinked just once. The studio lights caught the faint tremor in her hand as she adjusted the clasp on her necklace. For a long, suspended moment, she didn't move. The silence thickened until even the host seemed unsure what to do. Then the camera zoomed in closer. Her eyes glistened, her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, and instead she turned away. Nothing to say, she whispered. It was the smallest sentence, but it echoed like thunder. Julia let the silence linger before she nodded, as though she understood. Sometimes she said softly, "Silence says more than words." That clip ran for 40 seconds. Within an hour, it was everywhere. On TikTok, someone captioned it, "When love finally runs out of words." Another comment read, "Maybe silence is the only apology left." I didn't cry when I saw it. I just sat there watching the reflection of my own face in the laptop screen. 2 generations of women separated by a pause that felt like surrender. She hadn't said she was sorry, but for the first time she hadn't denied me either. The wind moved through the open door, carrying the faint smell of jasmine and salt. Ethan came in from the terrace holding a mug of coffee. You saw it. I nodded. He set the mug down. It's all over the news. They're calling it the moment America fell silent. He smiled faintly. They don't know her silence has always been the loudest thing in my life. He sat across from me, studying my face. How do you feel? Lighter, I said after a moment. It's strange. For years I thought I needed her to say something. Anything. But maybe this is enough. He reached over, brushing a strand of hair from my cheek. Maybe it is. The phone rang then, buzzing against the table. I picked it up and saw my father's name. "Hi, Dad," I said. His voice was soft, careful. "I just wanted to say, I saw the interview, and I saw yours too." I hesitated. "And I'm proud of you, kiddo." He said the words catching slightly. "You did something I never could." I leaned back in my chair, eyes stinging. "I didn't win anything, Dad. I just stopped fighting." "Sometimes that's the hardest thing," he said quietly. "Your mom, she's trying in her way." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Her way is quiet." "It always has been," he said. And for the first time there was no resignation in his voice, just understanding. When we hung up, I sat there for a while, letting the stillness sink in. The house was filled with the sound of the sea against the cliffs, steady and unhurried. I walked out onto the balcony. The sky had turned gold, the air heavy with the scent of salt and blooming thyme. My hair whipped in the wind as I leaned against the railing. "Thank you," I said softly. Not to anyone in particular, but to the wind, to the silence, to the years it had taken for her to finally not say anything at all. "Thank you for your silence, Mom," I whispered. "It said everything you couldn't." The horizon shimmered, the waves catching the last of the light. For a moment, the whole island glowed. Peace didn't come as a grand revelation. It came as a quiet exhale, a release so gentle it almost went unnoticed. Behind me, the laptop was still open. The frozen frame of my mother's face paused mid-turn. Her eyes, distant yet familiar, seemed to look past the camera and somehow straight at me. And for the first time I didn't feel like I was looking at an opponent. I was looking at a woman who had never been taught how to love without control, who had done her best with what she knew. The wind carried the faint sound of church bells from the village below. I closed my eyes, listening. It didn't sound like victory. It sounded like forgiveness. The air had changed. The heat that once wrapped the island like a fever had softened into something cooler, slower. Santorini in late season always felt like an afterthought. Less noise, fewer cameras. The tourists gone home to tell their versions of what this place meant. The sea, for once, was left to breathe. I walked down the narrow path toward the little cafe overlooking the cliffs, the one where Ethan and I had first met again. The tables were mostly empty now. A few locals sat with their espresso talking quietly in Greek. The sound of waves below was steady and low, like a heartbeat you could walk in rhythm with. I ordered coffee and took the table by the railing. The wind smelled of salt and rain. I'd planned to leave the next morning to go home, though I still didn't know where home was supposed to be anymore. That's when I saw her, Helen Moore. Tan skin, blonde hair tucked under a scarf camera hanging from her neck. The woman whose video had accidentally rewritten my life. She froze for a second, then smiled. Recognition lighting her face. "Clara Bennett," she said, walking over. "I almost didn't believe it was you." I laughed softly. "I didn't believe it was me either at first." She hesitated, eyes searching mine. "I hope you're not angry. I never thought it would spread like that. It was just beautiful." "I'm not angry," I said. "Maybe it happened because it was real for a moment. That's all people want now, something real." She nodded. "Thousands of messages came in after I posted it. People said your smile made them believe in love again. In possibility." Her voice broke slightly on that last word, and I felt something warm settle in my chest. "Then maybe it was worth it," I said. She reached out and squeezed my hand. I think it was. We didn't talk much after that. We just finished our coffees and sat in companionable quiet, two strangers tied together by a story neither of us had tried to write. When we said goodbye, she hugged me briefly, the kind of embrace that feels like closure and blessing at once. By the time I walked back to the villa, the sun was already low, bleeding orange across the sky. Ethan was on the balcony packing camera lenses into a worn leather bag. The air between us hummed with the unspoken truth that this was our last evening together here. Switzerland tomorrow. I asked, leaning on the doorway. He looked up and smiled. "Early flight. The next project waits for no one. I thought you might stay a little longer. I thought about it," he said, closing the bag, "but maybe some stories are only meant to last one chapter." He poured 2 glasses of wine and handed me one. We sat side by side, the light turning softer as the sea faded into silver. "I keep thinking about how it started," I said. "That day in the cafe. It feels like a lifetime ago. He nodded, watching the horizon. You know, if there's a next life, I hope we meet without all the noise, without reasons. Just because. I smiled, my throat tight. If there's a next time, let's not make it an accident. He looked at me, then really looked, and for a second I thought he might say something more. But instead he reached over, brushed his thumb against my wrist, and said, "Deal." We didn't promise anything. No grand declarations. Just silence and the slow, patient sound of waves below. Sometimes the absence of words means you're finally saying everything that matters. When the moon rose, the light spilled across the terrace, soft and silver. Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. I watched the curve of his mouth, memorizing the shape of this piece, before it too became memory. We stayed like that until the wine was gone and the stars began to scatter more thickly over the sea. Later, after he'd gone inside, I walked down the stone steps toward the beach. The sand was cool against my feet. The tide reached up to greet me, a gentle brush against my ankles. I crouched and let my hand skim the surface of the water. It was colder than I expected grounding. The moonlight rippled across it, breaking into tiny fragments of white. I found a small seashell half buried near the rocks, spiraled, imperfect, faintly pink inside. I turned it over in my palm, smiling. Then I slipped it into my pocket next to the folded letter I still hadn't sent to Grace. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of pine from the cliffs. The world around me was quiet, except for the soft rhythm of the sea. Not every story ends with a storm. Some just end with the tide carrying what's left of you into something new. I walked along the shoreline, letting the waves chase my footprints. Behind me, the lights of the villa shimmered against the dark, and ahead, the horizon waited, open, endless, unjudging. Maybe not everyone gets a miracle, but anyone can make room for one. All it takes is learning how to let go, a year later. Portland didn't feel like the same city I'd left behind. Maybe it hadn't changed. Maybe I had. The rain still came soft and steady, painting the streets silver, and the air still smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. But the noise inside me was gone. My new studio, Love Made Real, sat in an old warehouse district by the river where light spilled through tall windows and landed on white tables, wooden chairs, and vases of dried lavender. The scent filled the room, warm and calming. I'd opened it 6 months ago not to plan weddings, but to teach other women how to create beauty from chaos. That morning, 10 women sat around the table. Some retired teachers, a single mother, a woman who'd just left a 30-year marriage, and I handed them rolls of ribbon and sprigs of wildflowers. Design is about truth, I said. It's not about perfection. You're not decorating for someone else. You're telling a story. Yours. They smiled, some shy, some radiant. Watching them made something inside me ache in a good way. A year ago, I'd been erased from someone else's story. Now I was helping others write theirs. After class, when the last woman left, I stood in the middle of the studio. The sunlight through the window caught on the new frame hanging by the door, a photograph of the Santorini sea at sunset, the same one Ethan had taken just before we said goodbye. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Peace is the quietest kind of revenge." I smiled every time I saw it. It reminded me that healing didn't have to be loud, and that sometimes walking away was the most powerful thing you could do. The computer on my desk pinged with a new email. I almost ignored it, but the sender's name caught my eye. Grace Parker. I opened it slowly. "Hi, Clara. I thought you should meet someone. Her name is Clara Grace Parker. She has your eyes, and she laughs like you did when we were kids. I wanted her to know who she's named after. Not the version on the internet, but the one who taught me what real love looks like." Attached was a photo, a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket, cheeks. Round eyes, bright and curious. I felt the air leave my chest in a single breath. I laughed softly, though my vision blurred. Then I saw the second message, one without a sender name, just a scanned note written in the careful, slanted script I'd known all my life. "You look happy, Clara." That's all I ever wanted. No signature, just that one line. I sat back in my chair staring at it. For the first time, my mother's words didn't carry sharp edges. They were soft, almost tender. I printed the message and set it beside the photo of the baby. The morning sun drifted across both, turning the paper gold. For a long moment, I just watched the light move. I wasn't crying. Not exactly. It felt more like something inside me had finally exhaled. Later that afternoon, I locked up the studio and walked down to the harbor. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that looked infinite. Seagulls drifted above the water, and the wind tugged at my hair. I reached into my coat pocket and found the small seashell from Santorini. The same one I'd carried all this time, the one that had outlasted storms flights and 1,000 miles of change. Its surface was smooth from my fingers. I held it up to the sunlight. It glowed faintly pink like it still remembered where it came from. Then I threw it. The shell arced through the air, spinning once before it disappeared into the water with a small ripple. I stood there watching the waves close over it, my reflection breaking on the surface. For a moment, everything around me, the wind, the gulls, the distant hum of the city, fell away. There was only quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty but full, the kind that means peace. And if you've ever been the one cut out of someone else's picture, erased from a story that should have had your name in it, remember this: sometimes the miracle only begins when you finally step outside the frame.